As we continue to watch the U.S.-led war unfold against Iran, there are important developments for a country in crisis that President Trump says is next on his hit list, and that is Cuba. Last week, a Russian tanker carrying oil to Cuba was allowed to dock after a near-total U.S. blockade that's been in place since January. Experts say the 730,000 barrels being offloaded now could ease Cuba's dire energy crisis for probably a few weeks. That U.S. blockade has roiled daily life for an island nation of 11 million people. Across Cuba, electricity blackouts have left families in the dark. The lack of fuel has forced hospitals to limit surgeries. It's disrupted water systems and food distribution. And litter has piled up in Havana and other Cuban cities because garbage trucks don't have the diesel fuel to make their usual runs. Now, Cuba has long had a fragile energy grid that's reliant on oil imports, and for years, Venezuela sent subsidized oil shipments to Cuba to prop up its ally. But those shipments stopped in January after the U.S. captured the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro in a deadly military attack, and since then, the U.S. Navy's blockade of Cuba and Trump's tariff threats against any country that ships oil to Cuba have pretty much halted fuel deliveries, and that has crushed Cuba's economy. The Russian tanker is the first oil shipment to get through to Cuba in months. The White House addressed it on Monday. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called it a, quote, decision that will continue to be made on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian reasons or otherwise, adding that there's been no firm change in our sanctions policy, end quote. A few days later, Cuba said it would release more than 2,000 prisoners as a, quote, humanitarian gesture during Holy Week. Whether this moment is a genuine shift in diplomacy or a brief pause in a tightening vice remains to be seen. David Ariosto joins me now. He's a veteran journalist who spent extended time overseas, including living in Cuba. His time there is the basis of one of his books titled This is Cuba, an American journalist under Castro's shadow. He's also the author of a brand new book called Open Space, From Earth to Eternity, the global race to explore and conquer the cosmos. David, thanks for being back. I'm rereading This is Cuba. I read it many years ago when you put it out there. It's wildly relevant today because when under Obama, when things eased up with Cuba, tourism exploded, and it became really a lifeline for Cuba. These power outages in Cuba are not just making life hell for Cubans, but it's affecting one of their biggest sources of currency because people can't visit there easily anymore.
Yeah, Cuba, I mean, it's good to see you, Alan. Cuba is probably facing what is tantamount to a bit of a perfect storm, right? So you have the clampdown in terms of sort of reversal of a lot of the policies the Obama administration put in place that opened up a lot of that sort of microfinance. Has been rolled back by the Trump administration. You had the impacts of COVID and the reduction in tourism dollars that this country benefited from. And then you have the reduction in Venezuelan oil that served as a subsidy much in the same way that Soviet subsidies had propped up Cuba through much of the 1970s and 80s. And, you know, what we're seeing now is not only a system that's sort of teetering on the brink of the humanitarian crisis, but also a system that doesn't necessarily have the benefit of that 1-2 punch. And I use the term benefit very loosely, but the ability to corral power in the same way that Fidel and Raul Castro were. Raul Castro is in retirement. Fidel Castro is dead. And Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is the president, he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, has managed to corral as best he can sort of the influence and forces. But, you know, at the same time, I don't know that you have an administration in the United States that has more leveraging power with regard to its influence in Cuba than this Trump administration. So it could be an inflection point. I mean, we've seen protests erupt in parts of the country. There's a lot of press given to that. This is not terribly new. I would say it's new for attacking a government facility, a party compound. But in the past, especially during the fall of the Soviet Union, you had protesters that would show up on the streets, and Fidel Castro would go down to the Malecón and would sort of quiet his countrymen and basically get his power sort of behind him in terms of, you know, how he was corralling the officials and how he was putting down displeasure. You don't necessarily have that same sort of bombastic leader on the world stage anymore. So it's a precarious moment for Cuba nonetheless.
Is there a negotiation going on? I mean, this is weird. That America had said there's no chance that Russian tanker is going to reach Cuba. Then suddenly the Russian tanker reaches Cuba. Then Cuba says it's releasing 2,000 prisoners. Then Cuba has come up with some formula by which it will lease land to either people who lost land or private enterprises. It's not a reversal of what happened in the revolution, but it's something. Is there something going on here?
Cuba has a capacity to do as much as it needs to do to kind of get to this next phase. And so, reports that Raul Castro's grandson has been meeting with Marco Rubio, reports of Alejandro Castro Espin, who is Raul Castro's son, sort of reemerging on the public scene. If you remember, Alejandro Castro Espin was the one who was meeting with Carlos Zuniga during the Obama administration. So, there is a natural.
Well, I think I remember the fact that he was in a bar in Havana with you. Is that the same guy I'm thinking about?
It was one of the last people that I inadvertently sort of stumbled across and ended up inadvertently sharing a bar with the very man who was overseeing the Ministry of Interior, who was tasked with spying on journalists. So I was one of those journalists, and I think we each had a Bucanero beer at the time. But this is a man who also worked with the highest levels of the Obama administration, has quietly now reemerged in some of the dialogue in the rumor mill that kind of pumps through Havana. So, and it's also not a coincidence that these prisoners, we don't know that they're political prisoners, right, are being released during the Easter week, because the Vatican has played a long-standing role. But I will speak to that point about political prisoners. It's really interesting when the majority of the economy is facing shortages and scarcities. Everyone is forced to go to the black market. And if everyone is forced to go to the black market, then everyone is a potential criminal. Yep. And so that leverage point in terms of who's a criminal and who's not, I myself had gone to the black market many, many, many times just to get basic foodstuffs when I lived there for the course of 2 years. So, on the one hand, you have this leverage in terms of political influence and power. On the other hand, you have groups, particularly those scions of the Castro family, that are quietly meeting behind the scenes with the very sort of Cuban Americans who are pushing this, namely Marco Rubio. And so what you have is this very kind of cloak and dagger enterprise that is long a hallmark of Cuban policies. But I think that the difference now is that this perfect storm that I mentioned in the beginning of the lack of tourism dollars, the lack of Venezuelan oil subsidies, and the fact that the Trump administration is cracking down, particularly in the fact that you don't have that exit route. So Cubans in the past, when they were facing political pressure, would simply leave. They can't really do that. So there's a real question of what comes next.
So let me just ask you this, because you've seen the ups and downs in Cuba. How bad is it for the average Cuban right now in Cuba? We've heard there are internet problems, there's power problems, there's power shortages. How bad is it?
Yeah, it's for someone who's not there. I'd be hesitant to say that I have a real pulse on it, but I have talked to people in Havana across the island, and when you don't have energy, you don't have a functioning economy, and you don't have functioning medical facilities, and you don't have functioning school systems, transportation. So it filters through every different aspect of the country. And when you're seeing other clampdowns in terms of punishment of countries doing trade with Cuba, I mean, that existed for years and years and years in terms of the trade embargo, in the sense that any ship that docked in a Cuban port couldn't dock in an American port. Right. And as a result, you're not going to avoid the biggest trading partner in the region. So all of this is coalescing around just a real suffering for the Cuban rank and file. And I think that's, in many ways, the unspoken story in all of this, is that, the Castros don't suffer in terms of what they can get and what they have access to. Right. The upper echelon and elite don't suffer. But there's a line that Fidel Castro put out once. He said, "I am willing to let my people suffer. Are you willing to let my people suffer?"
Yeah. All right, David, thanks as always. We appreciate your analysis. David Ariosto is a veteran journalist and columnist. He's the author of the book, This is Cuba, and the author of the brand new book, Open Space. All right, coming up, back in January, Trump justified the immigration crackdown in Minnesota with his claim that those being arrested were the worst of the worst.